The courthouse had always been an imposing building, its brick walls worn by decades of storms, protests, and whispered arguments beneath its stone steps. On most mornings, it looked sleepy and still, with only a trickle of attorneys climbing the staircase or an occasional officer pushing through the heavy oak doors. But that morning was different. Long before the hearing was scheduled to begin, the courthouse was already alive with activity. Reporters parked vans across the street, their cameras trained on the entrance like hunters waiting for prey. Neighbors who had nothing to do with the case wandered toward the front steps, curious and restless, drawn by the promise of drama. Inside, the hallways carried the restless buzz of voices bouncing against the high ceilings. The air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the kind of mixture that clung to every government building. Court staff moved briskly from one end of the hall to the other, clutching folders stacked so high they threatened to topple. A bailiff cleared his throat as he guided people toward the correct courtroom, already warning stragglers that seats would be limited. By 9 o'clock, the room was nearly full, with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in the public gallery. The case had fascinated the small town for weeks. At its heart was a police K-9, a German shepherd named Rex, whose reputation as a loyal and fearless partner had long been respected. For years, he had been trotted out during demonstrations at schools, wagging his tail as children clapped at his obedience and skill. But all of that pride and admiration had been shaken by one incident, an arrest gone wrong. A suspect had been injured badly, and people whispered that Rex hadn't just restrained him, he had mauled him. What made the case even more complicated was the fact that a child, an innocent bystander, had been there to witness it all. The courtroom reflected that tension. On one side, rows of uniformed officers sat rigid, their badges catching the dull glow of fluorescent lights. They didn't speak, but the stern set of their jaws made their allegiance clear. On the other side, townspeople shifted in their seats, some muttering that the dog should never have been there in the first place. Others worried about what this case would mean for law enforcement. In the middle sat the jury, trying their best to appear neutral, though their eyes often flickered toward the large shepherd sitting quietly beside his handler. Rex was impossible to ignore. Even as people tried to focus on the lawyers shuffling papers, their gazes kept sliding toward the animal. His coat was thick and well-groomed, his posture alert but calm. Every so often, his ears twitched at the creak of a chair or the shuffle of a foot, but otherwise, he seemed unbothered by the crowd. To anyone who hadn't read the headlines, he looked like the perfect example of discipline, a dog trained to serve, not harm. But those who knew what the hearing was about couldn't look at him without remembering the photographs of the injured man, the hospital bandages, the blood. At precisely 9:30, the bailiff's voice cut through the buzz. All rise. The room stood as Judge Ellison entered. He was an older man, his silver hair carefully combed, his black robe flowing as he climbed to his bench. He scanned the room with eyes that seemed to take in every detail at once. The reporters with their pens hovering above notepads, the officers in their seats, the nervous shifting of the jurors. His gavel struck once, sharp and final. Be seated, the trial resumed. The prosecution began by outlining what the jury would hear, testimony about whether Rex had acted within his training or had been used improperly by his handler. The defense countered quickly, painting Rex as a hero, a disciplined officer in his own right, who had done exactly what he had been taught. The back and forth was familiar, almost routine. Papers rustled, attorneys spoke in firm but measured tones, and the audience sat stiffly, trying to interpret every word. Then the bailiff opened the side door. Every head turned. A little girl walked in, holding the hand of her guardian. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dress was plain, pale yellow, with small blue flowers stitched along the hem. In her other hand, she clutched a stuffed rabbit so worn that its fur had thinned to patches. She looked far too small for the room she had just entered, a room filled with polished shoes, starched uniforms, and heavy stairs. The atmosphere shifted. Reporters leaned forward, pens at the ready. A few jurors exchanged quick glances, aware of how unusual it was for a child to testify in such a case. Even Judge Ellison seemed to soften his expression, his eyes following the girl as she was led to the witness stand. Her steps echoed softly across the wooden floor, each tap of her shoes making the silence feel heavier. The stuffed rabbit bounced slightly in her grasp, its long ears dragging as she climbed carefully onto the chair. The guardian squeezed her hand, whispered something encouraging, and stepped back. Now she was alone, perched above a sea of faces, most of them strangers. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor approached slowly, lowering himself to one knee so his eyes met hers. His voice, so firm moments earlier, gentled as he spoke. "Do you know why you're here today?" The girl nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "You're very brave," he continued softly. "We just want you to tell us what you remember. That's all." She clutched the rabbit tighter, her knuckles whitening around its stitched paw. Her gaze darted across the room, to the jurors, to the officers, to the defense table. Then her eyes landed on Rex. The dog sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her. For a long moment, it looked as though the child and the animal were locked in a private exchange no one else could understand. Her small chest rose and fell quickly, her breath catching as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't quite find the words. The silence stretched. And still, no one in the courtroom dared to move. It was in that charged stillness, with the reporters scribbling furiously, with the officers sitting stiff-backed, with the jury leaning ever so slightly forward, that the weight of the hearing truly settled over everyone. This wasn't just another case, another dispute between lawyers. This was something more fragile, more human. A child was about to speak, and what she said could change everything. The girl sat in the witness chair, as though it were too large for her small frame swallowed by the high wooden back. The stuffed rabbit remained clutched tightly in her hands, its floppy ears brushing against her knees. Her guardian had stepped aside, now standing near the wall, watching anxiously. The prosecutor stayed crouched before her, speaking in a tone more suited for a bedtime story than a courtroom. Yet no one dared call it condescending. Everyone in the room understood the delicate balance at play. She was not just another witness. She was the witness. Reporters leaned forward, the scratching of pens already beginning as they tried to capture the moment. Some described her appearance in detail: the yellow dress with faded blue flowers, the scuffed shoes, the way her brown hair fell unevenly as though someone had brushed it in a rush that morning. Others scribbled impressions of her body language, noting the way her knees pressed together, her shoulders hunched as though she were trying to make herself smaller in a room that felt too heavy for someone her age. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had built his case around logic, precedent, and procedure, the language of adults who lived and breathed the courtroom. A child did not fit into his strategy. Children, after all, did not speak in carefully measured sentences. They spoke in bursts of honesty, often brutal, always disarming. He tapped his pen against his notepad, already considering how to dismantle whatever testimony she might give. On the other side, the officers sat rigid, their loyalty unwavering. To them, Rex was family. He had been their partner in raids, their protector on dark streets, their reassurance during dangerous standoffs. They saw him as a symbol of loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice. Watching a child stare at him with wide eyes unsettled them. They could not imagine that the shepherd they trusted with their lives might be remembered as anything less than heroic. The girl, however, did not see any of that. To her, the courtroom wasn't a battlefield between legal teams or a test of reputations. It was simply a room full of strangers, all waiting for her to speak about the day she had seen something that frightened her. And when she looked across the room, her gaze did not linger on the judge or the attorneys. It stopped on the shepherd, Rex. His handler, Officer Harlan, kept a firm grip on the leash. The dog sat patiently, his dark eyes steady, his posture disciplined. To the officers in the gallery, he looked perfect, the very image of a trained canine. To the girl, however, those same eyes carried weight. She remembered how they had looked that day, sharp, unblinking, locked onto their target. She remembered the growl that rumbled through his chest, low and frightening. Even now, in the safety of the courtroom, she felt her stomach tighten at the memory. The prosecutor gave her a gentle smile. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "can you tell us your name?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Emily." "And how old are you, Emily?" "7." Her answer rippled through the room. 7. Old enough to understand what she had seen, too young to embellish it with the complexities adults often layered onto their stories. Her age gave her words a gravity no attorney could easily argue against. The prosecutor continued carefully. "Emily, do you remember the day when the police came to the street near your house?" She nodded, her grip tightening on the rabbit. "Can you tell us what you saw?" The courtroom leaned forward, as though the entire room had taken a single collective step closer. Emily hesitated, her small brow furrowing. She glanced at the judge, at the jurors, and then at Rex again. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The silence stretched. To the defense, the pause was a lifeline. Perhaps she was too nervous to speak. Perhaps the memory would crumble under pressure. But to the prosecution, it was only a matter of patience. They had seen this before. Children needed time. They needed space to trust their own voices. Emily squeezed the rabbit again, the soft fabric comforting beneath her fingers. She took a small breath, her shoulders rising and falling. Then she began to speak. "I was playing outside," she said slowly. "I heard yelling. And I saw the man. He was on the ground." The prosecutor nodded gently. "And then what happened?" Her eyes flicked to Rex. The dog came. A ripple ran through the gallery. Some officers shifted, crossing their arms tightly. A juror scribbled furiously on his notepad. Reporters leaned closer, their pens moving faster. "What did the dog do, Emily?" Her lips pressed together. The memory flashed before her, the dog lunging forward, teeth flashing, the sound of fabric tearing, the man's cry of pain. She blinked hard, as if trying to push the picture away. "He," her voice faltered. She glanced at her guardian, who gave her a reassuring nod. She looked back at the prosecutor. "He bit him." The words dropped into the room like a stone into water. The defense attorney immediately sat up straighter. "Objection," he called, his voice sharp. Leading the witness, the judge lifted a hand, silencing the objection. "Overruled. She may continue." Emily's eyes widened slightly at the interruption, but the prosecutor leaned in, his voice calm. "You're doing very well, Emily. Just tell us what you remember. Did the man do anything when the dog bit him?" She shook her head. "He cried. He was on the ground. He didn't move." The prosecutor gave her a small nod. "Thank you, Emily." The defense attorney scribbled notes furiously. He would argue later that children often misunderstood situations, that what Emily thought she saw was not the full picture. He would insist that the suspect had resisted arrest, that Rex had done exactly what he was trained to do. But deep down, he knew what everyone else in the room was beginning to realize. Emily's words carried a power no cross-examination could easily strip away. Because Emily had not given a speech. She had not crafted an argument. She had simply remembered. And memory, when spoken through the voice of a child, often carried more weight than any polished testimony. Her guardian watched from the sidelines, her eyes glistening with pride and worry. She knew how much courage it took for Emily to sit there. The courtroom had felt enormous, even to her as an adult. To a child, it must have felt like the entire world. Yet Emily had held her ground, her small voice cutting through the noise with an honesty no one could deny. And though the hearing would stretch on for hours, though attorneys would argue and object and present evidence, it was Emily's presence on that stand that lingered. She was not just a witness. She was the moment the case shifted from technicalities to truth. She was the witness the courtroom would never forget. The courtroom had grown heavier since Emily left the stand. Though her testimony had been brief, its weight lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Reporters whispered frantically to one another during recess, rushing out into the hallways to send updates to their editors. Jurors avoided one another's eyes, scribbling notes but clearly shaken. And at the defense table, Officer Harlan's jaw clenched as he sat stiffly beside his dog, Rex, who rested obediently at his feet. The child's words echoed silently through everyone's thoughts. He bit him. He didn't move. Now it was time for the prosecution to sharpen those words into the heart of their case. When the court reconvened, Prosecutor Daniels rose to his feet, his glasses catching the sterile glow of the overhead lights. He was a seasoned attorney, known for his careful pacing and ability to weave small details into a tapestry of undeniable truth. He didn't need to shout to command attention. His steady voice carried the weight of conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, walking slowly before them, "this case is not about loyalty, nor about tradition, nor even about the bond between man and dog. This case is about the use of force. It is about responsibility. And most importantly, it is about what happens when that responsibility is abused." The defense attorney immediately scribbled something down, already preparing to object. But Daniels pressed on. "You heard the testimony of young Emily, a child who had no agenda, no reason to lie. She told you plainly what she saw. A man on the ground, not resisting, and a dog ordered to attack. She told you the truth, unclouded by bias, untainted by strategy. Now, we must examine what that truth means." He paused, letting his words settle. The jurors shifted slightly, their pens hovering but unmoving. "The defense will tell you Rex is a hero," Daniels continued. "They will tell you he is disciplined, that he acts only when ordered, that he is a symbol of safety in our community. And perhaps he was once. But on that day, the day of the arrest, Rex was not a symbol of safety. He was a weapon. And like any weapon, he was in the hands of someone responsible for choosing how and when to use him." He gestured subtly toward Officer Harlan, who sat rigid, his lips pressed into a thin line. The accused had already subdued the suspect. The man was on the ground, his hands restrained. He posed no threat to the officers or to the public. And yet, instead of restraint, instead of control, Officer Harlan unleashed Rex. The result? A man who could not defend himself suffered serious injuries. Injuries that required hospitalization and months of recovery. That is not policing. That is punishment. That is cruelty. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is abuse of power. A murmur rippled through the gallery. On the defense side, Attorney Marks rose. "Objection. Counsel is inflaming the jury." The judge lifted a hand. "Overruled. A jury will remember this is opening argument." "Proceed, Mr. Daniels." Daniels gave a polite nod, then turned back toward the jurors, his tone lowering as if confiding in them. "Ask yourselves this. If Rex had been a baton, or a taser, or even a firearm, would we be sitting here debating whether it was appropriate to use him on an unarmed, subdued man? No, We would all agree it was an excessive use of force. So why should it be different simply because the weapon has fur and 4 legs? Why should a dog, no matter how well trained, be exempt from the responsibility we demand of every other tool of law enforcement? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unshakable. Daniel stepped back, his part of the statement complete. He knew the image he had left would stick. Rex as a weapon, wielded improperly. Now it was the defense's turn. Attorney Marks rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm. He was younger than Daniels, but sharp, with a reputation for fiery rebuttals. He moved to the center of the courtroom, standing tall, his voice ringing with controlled outrage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we cannot allow ourselves to be swayed by emotion, however compelling it may seem. Yes, we heard the words of a child. Yes, we saw her point at a dog and say, 'Bad dog,' but let us remember, children, while honest, do not always understand the full scope of what they witness. They see fragments, not the whole picture. They hear noise, but not the context. And it is context that matters." He paced slowly, his eyes flicking from juror to juror. The suspect in question was not an innocent bystander. He was a man with a violent history, a man who had already resisted arrest on multiple occasions. On that day, when officers attempted to apprehend him, he fought back. Witnesses may claim he was on the ground, but the officers on scene knew better. They knew he was still a threat. They knew he could rise, lash out, harm them, or worse. Rex was not unleashed as punishment. He was deployed as protection. Marks turned, gesturing toward Rex, who remained still and composed beside Harlan. "Look at him," Marks said, his voice softening. "This is not a beast. This is not a weapon. This is a partner. A partner who has saved lives, who has stood between his handler and danger time and again. Rex does not act out of cruelty. He acts out of training, discipline, and loyalty. And on that day, he acted to ensure that his fellow officers would return home safely to their families. That is not abuse. That is duty." The gallery murmured again, this time with voices of agreement. Some nodded, their eyes softening as they looked at Rex. Marks pressed the advantage. "If we condemn Rex, if we condemn Officer Harlan, then we condemn every officer who puts their trust in a canine partner. We send a message that hesitation is more important than survival, that split-second decisions made in the heat of danger will be second-guessed by those who were never there. That is not justice. That is undermining the very people sworn to protect us." He stopped, letting his words hang in the air. The courtroom was split. Some jurors shifted, clearly torn between the innocence of Emily's testimony and the logic of Marks's argument. Others stared at Rex, their thoughts unreadable. The judge finally cleared his throat. "We will recess until this afternoon." The gavel struck. Chairs scraped as people stood, voices bursting into the room as the tension finally spilled into whispers and debates. Reporters rushed out again, eager to craft headlines that would capture the day's drama. Prosecution calls K9 a weapon versus defense, calls K9 a hero. But beneath all the arguments, one thing was certain. The accusation had been made. Rex, once celebrated as a symbol of loyalty and safety, was now caught in the crosshairs of justice. And whether he was seen as a weapon or a hero would determine the fate of not only Officer Harlan, but the future of every K9 team in the county. The courtroom was restless after lunch, as though the entire room had been holding its breath since the morning session. The jury filed back into their box, their faces serious, betraying little of what they were feeling. Attorneys shuffled papers, their voices hushed, each preparing to seize the next moment. Officer Harlan sat at the defense table, his back straight, his eyes fixed on a point far away, as if looking beyond the walls of the room. Beside him, Rex lay still, his head resting on his paws, seemingly unaware of the storm of arguments swirling around him. The judge re-entered, his gavel striking once, calling the court back into order. "The prosecution may call its next witness," he said. There was a pause, brief but heavy. Everyone in the gallery knew what was coming. The prosecution nodded toward the side door, and the bailiff opened it. Emily appeared again. This time, she did not walk in with wide eyes, as though discovering the world for the first time. She looked tired, small shoulders drooping, the stuffed rabbit hanging loosely in her grip. Yet her presence still shifted the air. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Jurors straightened, alert. Officers in uniform tightened their jaws. The child, once more, was about to take center stage. Her guardian led her carefully to the witness stand. Emily climbed up, her feet dangling above the floor, the rabbit now perched on her lap. She glanced around the room, the lawyers, the jury, the judge, and then, inevitably, her gaze stopped on Rex. The shepherd's dark eyes were fixed on her, calm but unyielding. She froze for a heartbeat, then tore her eyes away, facing forward. The prosecutor approached slowly, his voice gentle. "Emily," he said softly, "you remember you're still under oath?" She nodded. "Good. I'm going to ask you a few more questions. Take your time." The room was utterly silent. Even the creak of benches seemed to vanish. The hum of the fluorescent lights above became strangely loud, a constant reminder of how still everything else was. "Emily," the prosecutor continued, crouching so he was eye level with her. "When you saw Rex that day, what did you think?" Her lips pressed together. She fidgeted with the rabbit's ear, twisting it between her fingers. The pause stretched. Seconds passed like minutes. A juror leaned slightly forward, his pen hovering above paper, but not moving. Another shifted in her seat, her eyes locked on the girl. The gallery seemed to lean collectively toward her, as if gravity itself pulled them in. The silence was unbearable, thick with anticipation. Emily's eyes flicked toward Rex again. The dog sat upright now, his head raised, his posture attentive. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to dissolve around her, leaving only the memory, the man on the ground, the shouting, the bark that had shaken her chest. Her breath caught. The prosecutor waited. He didn't push, didn't fill the void with more words. He understood that silence could be as powerful as testimony, that sometimes the truth emerged only after the quietest moments. Finally, Emily raised her hand. Her small finger trembled slightly, but it was unmistakable. She pointed across the courtroom, directly at Rex. The room gasped. A wave of sound rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Order!" he barked. "Order in the court." Emily's hand did not waver. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. The prosecutor leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper, though every person in the room could hear him. "Emily," he said gently, "can you tell us, in your own words, what you want us to know?" For a moment, she didn't speak. The silence deepened again, heavy and electric, every heart in the room pounding with expectation. Then she opened her mouth. 2 words emerged, soft but unmistakable. "Bad dog." The words fell into the silence like thunder. For an instant, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. Then slowly whispers began to spread, a wave of murmurs that filled the space like rising water. Reporters scribbled furiously, the phrase "bad dog" appearing again and again in hurried handwriting. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Even the officers shifted uncomfortably, some frowning, others pressing their lips together. The judge struck his gavel again. Silence. There will be silence in this courtroom. But no gavel could erase what had just been said. Those 2 words, delivered by a 7-year-old, carried more force than hours of legal arguments. They were not rehearsed, not strategic, not political. They were raw, honest, innocent, and in their simplicity, they cut through the layers of defense and prosecution like a blade. Emily lowered her hand, clutching her rabbit tightly. Her chest rose and fell quickly, as though speaking had cost her more than anyone realized. Yet she did not cry, did not look away. She sat in that chair, small but unshakable, having said the only thing she felt was true. Bad dog. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. Objection. He barked. This is prejudicial. It's the subjective opinion of a child. But even as he spoke, he knew how hollow the words sounded. No cross-examination could erase the impact. No objection could make the jury forget the sound of Emily's voice. The judge, his face unreadable, waved the objection aside. Overruled. The witness may step down. Emily slid off the chair, her guardian quickly moving to her side. Together, they walked back toward the door, the rabbit bouncing softly at her side. The gallery watched in silence, many with expressions that betrayed more emotion than they would admit. Even the reporters, hardened by years of trials and testimonies, seemed momentarily subdued, their pens hovering as though unsure how to capture what had just transpired. The door closed behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. The echoes of Emily's words had not yet faded when the courtroom descended into a low murmur, a tide of whispers washing over the benches. The little girl was gone now, escorted gently out by her guardian, but the image of her trembling hand, extended toward Rex, lingered like a phantom. Every person in the room carried it in their mind's eye, the small arm, the finger, the steady line pointing not at a man, not at a uniform, but at the dog itself. Pointing was such a simple gesture, the kind of thing a child might do dozens of times in a day, at a toy she wanted, a bird in the sky, a picture in a book. But here, in a courtroom swollen with tension, the act carried the weight of an entire accusation. It was no longer about what adults argued, but about what a child had chosen to reveal without hesitation. Attorney Daniels, the prosecutor, sat down slowly at his table, his pen tapping absent-mindedly against his legal pad. He didn't smile. He didn't nod triumphantly. He didn't need to. He knew what every juror had just seen. He knew that the point, the gesture itself, was evidence stronger than any report, stronger than any photograph. It was a memory etched into human behavior, raw, unfiltered truth pouring through the arm of a child. Across the aisle, Attorney Marks fumbled with his notes. His face remained composed, but his hands betrayed him, shuffling papers that no longer mattered. He understood the danger of what had just unfolded. Emily's point wasn't just testimony. It was theater, unplanned and unforgettable. Jurors would replay it in their minds when they lay awake that night. Reporters would describe it in detail on the evening news. Townspeople would repeat it on street corners. She pointed right at the dog. Said bad dog? Just like that. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had seen decades of trials, hundreds of witnesses, and he knew the strange alchemy that transformed simple acts into moments of indelible power. Sometimes it was a stammer, sometimes a tear, sometimes a silence so complete it became its own kind of testimony. Here it had been a point, nothing more, nothing less. And yet, in its purity, it struck with the force of a verdict. Meanwhile, Rex sat by his handler's side, tail curled neatly around his body, eyes unblinking. To him, the moment was no different from the countless hours he had spent in training, in courtrooms, in patrol cars. The humans whispered and shifted, but his world was steady. The familiar scent of his partner, the pressure of the leash against his collar, the calm discipline that years of repetition had etched into his bones. Yet the humans no longer saw him as steady. They saw him as accused. Officer Harlan felt the shift like a physical blow. He had trusted this dog with his life more times than he could count. Rex had pulled him out of danger in alleys, had stood between him and knives, had tracked missing children through dark woods. To him, Rex wasn't a weapon. He was family. But the child's finger, so small, so sure, had just placed Rex in the crosshairs of suspicion. Harlan's hand tightened on the leash, his jaw clenched. The jurors exchanged subtle glances, the kind they thought went unnoticed. One raised his eyebrows slightly, another chewed her lip, another scribbled something furiously on his pad. The point was burning its way into their deliberations before they had even begun. And the gallery, the citizens, the neighbors, the curious, couldn't stop buzzing. A man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Did you see her hand?" Straight at the dog, not even shaking. A young woman scribbled in her notebook. The smallest witness made the boldest accusation. Reporters whispered into phones, dictating descriptions. Her hand rose, her fingers stretched, and in that tiny gesture, the entire courtroom gasped. Attorney Marks finally rose, his voice cutting through the murmur like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you just saw was nothing more than the instinctive gesture of a frightened child. It is not evidence. It is not fact. It is the imagination of youth, misdirected and misunderstood." But even as he spoke, his words sounded fragile, brittle against the memory of the act itself. The jurors had already seen it. The gallery had already felt it. The judge had already acknowledged its gravity. The point existed, immutable, immune to rebuttal. Prosecutor Daniels didn't bother to object. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back in his chair, hands folded calmly on the table, his eyes flicking briefly to the jury. He knew what they were thinking, because pointing was not abstract. It was visceral. It was how humans communicated truth before they had words. Children pointed before they could speak, declaring what was real, what was near, what was threatening. Emily's gesture reached deeper than language, deeper than legal arguments. It spoke to something primal in everyone watching. And as the murmurs finally faded, replaced once more by the judge's stern command for order, the room seemed to hold its breath again. The air was charged, thick, as though lightning had passed through it and left an invisible residue. Emily was gone, but her finger still hovered in the minds of everyone there. She had pointed at Rex, and no one would forget it. The courthouse clock ticked past 3, its steady rhythm filling the pauses left by hushed voices. The sun, once sharp and golden, now slipped lower, spilling through the high windows in fractured beams. Dust floated in the light like drifting stars, turning the courtroom into something almost sacred. But no one was admiring the light. They were still caught in the gravity of what had just happened. The girl's gesture lingered in memory, her arm rising, her finger stretching toward Rex with that fragile certainty. And then the words. 2 of them, short, simple, impossible to forget. "Bad dog." They had slipped from her lips so softly, almost as though she hadn't intended to say them aloud. Yet they struck harder than any shouted accusation, because it wasn't the polished voice of a lawyer, or the stern tone of a judge, or the defensive bluster of an officer. It was a child's voice, high and trembling, yet crystal clear. The moment replayed itself in the minds of everyone present. The jurors, 11 strangers and 1 alternate bound together by civic duty, heard those words echoing in their heads, as though the child were still sitting before them. Some shifted uneasily in their seats, wrestling with the dissonance. Dogs were protectors. Police dogs even more so. Yet from the lips of innocence came condemnation. At the prosecutor's table, Daniels kept his gaze level, though inwardly he felt the ground shifting in his favor. He had built his case carefully. Reports, testimonies, expert opinions. But the child's words had become the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. Not because they were technical evidence, but because they were unforgettable. A closing argument could vanish from memory. 2 words spoken by a child could not. Across from him, Marks, the defense attorney, gripped his pen so tightly it threatened to snap. He had faced hostile witnesses before. He had cross-examined experts, dismantled testimony, sown doubt where certainty once stood. But how could he dismantle this? How could logic undo what everyone in the room had just heard? 2 words had done what hours of questioning could not. Painted Rex, and by extension Officer Harlan, in the darkest light. Officer Harlan sat stiffly, his chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. He had trusted the system. He had trusted procedure, training, his own sworn oath. But the system didn't know how to process a child's pain. And Harlan, the man who had relied on Rex like a brother in arms, now found himself staring at his partner through new eyes. The leash in his hand suddenly felt heavy, like a chain pulling them both into judgment. Rex, ever silent, seemed untouched by the storm around him. His ears twitched at the occasional scrape of a chair. His eyes remained fixed on Harlan, awaiting command. Loyal, steadfast. But to the humans in that room, his image had already been rewritten. No longer a tool of justice, but an object of doubt, an accused without words to defend himself. The gallery buzzed in restless waves, even as the judge struck his gavel for order. Reporters scribbled furiously, some underlining the phrase "bad dog" so hard their pens nearly tore the page. Observers leaned toward one another, whispering the words like a mantra. They were short enough to pass through every mouth, every headline, every conversation that would ripple out from this courtroom into the town beyond. In the back row, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes. "From the mouths of babes," she whispered to her neighbor. The man beside her nodded grimly, as though those 2 words had settled the matter more firmly than all the hours of evidence presented before. Judge Morrison leaned forward, hands folded, his eyes moving across the room like a sentinel. He had presided over hundreds of trials, had heard confessions, denials, lies, and truths tangled together. But he knew the unique weight of a child's words. They carried a purity that no oath could amplify, and no lawyer could dismantle. In 2 syllables, the girl had reframed the entire trial. "Order," he commanded again, though the murmurs were already fading on their own. The room didn't need discipline. It needed breath. Every person sat steeped in the echo of the child's voice, unable to shake it. Attorney Marks rose to speak, his voice breaking the spell. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you must remember, children do not always perceive events the way adults do. Words spoken in fear cannot be the measure of truth." He sounded steady, but he felt the futility in his own tone. Fear or not, the words existed. They had been spoken, etched into the record, stamped onto the hearts of the jurors. Attorney Daniels remained seated, his expression unreadable. He knew better than to gild what was already golden. Why add to perfection? The moment belonged not to him, but to Emily, to her finger, to her voice, to the clarity of those 2 words. As the trial edged on, the rhythm of questioning resumed, but everything felt altered. Witnesses testified. Experts droned. Lawyers objected and parried. Yet beneath every exchange, beneath every piece of evidence, the jurors heard the faint repetition. "Bad dog, bad dog, bad dog." And the silence that followed Emily's departure remained a ghost in the chamber. It was not the silence of boredom, nor of disinterest. It was the silence of weight. The silence of a truth so small and sharp it pierced through the noise. The day wound down, the clock hands crawling toward evening. The judge called for recess, his gavel falling with finality. The jurors filed out, their faces masks of neutrality, but their eyes shadowed by thought. The attorneys gathered their papers, though some pages lay forgotten. Harlan rose, Rex at his side, the leash taut as though both feared losing the other in the sea of shifting judgment. The gallery spilled into the corridors, their voices rising again, now that the gavel's restraint no longer bound them. And in every cluster of conversation, the words repeated like an echo chamber. She said it plain as day. Never heard a child so sure. 2 words, and the whole trial feels different now. Outside, the evening air carried the whispers further, seeding them into the town. By the time the courthouse emptied, the phrase had already escaped its walls. People who hadn't even been there would soon repeat it, as though they had seen the child's trembling finger themselves. And deep inside the courtroom, in the silence that remained after the doors shut, the ghost of her voice still lingered. 2 words. 2 words that no liar could erase. 2 words that would decide more than any brief, any exhibit, any closing argument. 2 words that changed everything. The courtroom was still shaking from the impact of Emily's testimony, though she had long since left the stand. 2 words, spoken in a voice that had no malice, no intention of strategy, had reverberated through every corner of the chamber. Bad dog. Those words hung in the air, sticky and electric, refusing to dissipate. They had struck not just the legal framework of the trial, but the very hearts of the people present. Even seasoned reporters, hardened by years of tense courtrooms and high-profile cases, sat frozen for a moment, pens hovering over their notebooks. They had covered protests, murders, and dramatic cross-examinations, but nothing had landed like this. A child, tiny, fragile, wholly human in her fear and honesty, had spoken and reshaped the courtroom's reality in a single gesture and phrase. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another beneath their breaths, careful not to be seen. Some scribbled notes furiously, as though capturing the words on paper could contain their power. Others leaned back, eyes distant, reliving the image of the small arm pointing straight at Rex, the dog's dark eyes watching silently, as if he, too, understood the weight of the accusation. For Officer Harlan, the reaction was almost physical. His chest tightened, and he felt a cold sweat forming along his back. He had spent years with Rex, counting on the dog as his constant companion in dangerous moments, relying on him as a partner who would protect him, never endanger him. Yet in the eyes of the child, and now in the eyes of the court, the jury, the gallery, Rex had become suspect, a weapon, something to fear rather than trust. The leash in his hand felt suddenly heavy, like a tangible measure of the judgment pressing down on both of them. Rex, however, remained poised, completely still, his gaze fixed on Harlan. To the dog, nothing had changed. To the humans in the room, everything had changed. Loyalty, duty, training, all of it had been reframed by 2 simple words spoken by a 7-year-old. Across the courtroom, Attorney Marks, the defense lawyer, tried to regain composure. He rose from his seat, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we must remember that children perceive the world differently. Their interpretation of events is not always accurate. Fear and misunderstanding are natural at that age." But even as he spoke, the conviction in his voice sounded hollow. Jurors' eyes flickered to Rex, to Harlan, and back to where Emily had been moments before. The image of the pointing finger and the child's unflinching gaze had etched itself into their memories in a way that could not be undone by logic or argument. A gallery was alive with whispers, quiet but insistent. Reporters spoke to one another, phones raised, dictating fragments of the testimony to be broadcast that evening. Child says bad dog, courtroom stunned. In clusters, the townspeople murmured, passing around the story like fire through dry grass. Even those who had arrived curious but skeptical now felt a ripple of unease, realizing that Emily's innocence carried a weight that no amount of professional training could counteract. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the bench. He was a man accustomed to controlling proceedings, but even he could not fully dictate the influence of a child's testimony. The power was not in the courtroom protocol, not in the objections, not in the legal strategies. The power had been delivered by a voice too small to shout, yet too honest to ignore. The prosecutor, Mr. Daniels, allowed himself a faint smile, a small acknowledgement that the moment had landed exactly as he had hoped. He did not gloat, for it was not his victory alone. Emily's courage had done the work, and he respected it. Sitting back, he watched the jury, letting them absorb the impact of what they had just witnessed. Each expression, each subtle movement, told him the child's words were already altering the trial's trajectory. As the day wore on, the courtroom became a theater of tension and contemplation. Witnesses who followed Emily onto the stand spoke carefully, aware of the shadow her words had cast. Officers testified about procedures, about protocol, about training. Lawyers debated technicalities and regulations. Yet every exchange, every sentence, seemed to echo with her voice, "Bad dog." It was as though the courtroom itself had absorbed her judgment, and all subsequent arguments had to contend with it. Outside the courtroom, conversations erupted like wildfire. People crowded around courthouse doors, discussing Emily's courage and the potency of her observation. Some spoke in awe. "Did you see how sure she was?" One man asked his neighbor. "She wasn't scared of anyone or anything in there. Just pointing." And saying it like that. Others were defensive, protective of Rex and Officer Harlan. "That dog has saved lives," one woman argued. "You can't just judge him by what a scared little girl says. He's trained, disciplined, loyal." The debate was already spreading across the town like a fever, splitting loyalties and challenging assumptions. Emily had become the center of a whirlwind, a child whose simple honesty had forced adults to confront their own beliefs about trust, power, and responsibility. Back in the courtroom, Harlan's mind raced. He thought of the moments leading up to the incident, the chaos on the street, the shouting, the suspect resisting arrest. He remembered Rex's training, the countless hours spent preparing for unpredictable situations. He had always believed that his decisions in the moment were right, that Rex had acted properly, that justice had been served. But now, faced with the clarity of a child's perspective, doubt crept in. Perhaps he had been too hasty. Perhaps the line had been crossed. Rex, blissfully unaware of human moral dilemmas, remained calm at his handler's side. Yet even he seemed to sense the tension, the shift in the air, the weight of human judgment pressing down. He tilted his head, ears flicking, as though waiting for a signal that never came. The jury, meanwhile, grappled with their own reactions. They were trained to weigh evidence, to parse testimony, to consider context. And yet, Emily's testimony could not be weighed in the same way. It was raw, immediate, and visceral. The pointing finger and the words "bad dog" had a clarity no deposition could match. They had spoken truth, or at least what the child perceived as truth, in a manner that was impossible to ignore. Reporters scribbled in frenzy. Some whispered into microphones, others dictated into phones, crafting sentences designed to capture the electricity of the moment. Child's testimony stuns courtroom. 2 words reshaped the trial. It was viral before the ink had dried, and the ripple effect extended beyond the courthouse walls. Conversations in cafes, workplaces, and living rooms carried the weight of Emily's words. People debated, argued, and reflected, whether they had witnessed the event firsthand or only heard it recounted. Those 2 words had grown legs, traveling faster than any press release, faster than any legal brief, faster than the arguments of attorneys. Even the judge felt it. Every time he looked at the jury, every time he glanced at Rex, he was reminded of the fragility and power of a child's perception. He had presided over countless cases, but few had wielded influence in such a simple, pure form. And he knew it would not be forgotten. By the end of the day, the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer just a place of law. It was a crucible where innocence, experience, and authority collided. The reactions of the people in that room, from the hardened attorneys to the curious townspeople, had all been shaped, subtly but irrevocably, by Emily's courage. And though the proceedings would continue, though legal arguments would resume, and witnesses would follow, and evidence would be dissected with painstaking detail, the two words remained. They were a shadow, a lens, a measure by which every subsequent statement would be judged. Emily had spoken. The courtroom had reacted. And the world outside, already buzzing with whispers and retellings, would react in turn. The weight of honesty, distilled into a child's voice, had altered everything. The courtroom was finally emptying, the echoes of the day lingering in the heavy air like a scent that refused to dissipate. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor, voices whispered, and the gavel strike had long since faded. Yet the memory of Emily's testimony, her trembling finger, and the two words she had spoken, "bad dog," lingered, unyielding and relentless. Officer Harlan remained seated for a moment, staring at Rex. The dog had not moved, not shifted, not even blinked, yet Harlan felt as if the world itself had tilted beneath him. The weight of judgment, carried on the shoulders of a 7-year-old, had transformed the perception of years of service into a single, unbearable instant of doubt. He gripped the leash tighter, feeling the tension radiate through his hands, through his arms, through every thought that ran like wildfire in his mind. Rex tilted his head, ears flicking in curiosity, completely oblivious to the emotional storm surrounding him. To the dog, the courthouse was just a place of humans and sense, of commands and routines. Yet to every adult who had witnessed the morning, the day, the testimony, and the moment of accusation, Rex had changed forever, not in reality, but in perception. Outside the courthouse, the streets hummed with conversation. Reporters crowded near the steps, broadcasting updates, sending videos and photos across social media platforms, capturing not just the testimony, but the intensity of the courtroom's reaction. One reporter described it as a 7-year-old's words cutting through decades of authority, another as a child's point rewriting the narrative of a trial. People gathered on corners, in cafes, in offices, repeating the story, debating whether justice had been served or subverted by innocence. The townspeople, many of whom had long supported the police department and its K-9 units, were divided. Some defended Rex and Harlan fiercely, arguing that 2 words from a child could not outweigh training, expertise, and years of service. Others felt a shiver of doubt, recalling Emily's words and gesture, and wondering how easily they had cut through the layers of procedure and authority to strike at the heart of truth. In the courthouse hallways, the remaining officers whispered among themselves. Some spoke of Rex's flawless record, the lives he had saved, the dangers he had faced alongside his handler. Others shook their heads quietly, acknowledging that Emily's perspective, simple though it was, could not be dismissed so easily. The child had observed something adults might have rationalized away, and in doing so, she had reminded them that perception, even from the smallest among them, held a unique and sometimes unassailable power. The defense and prosecution retreated to their offices, papers scattered, arguments reconsidered. Marks, the defense attorney, pored over transcripts, trying to find a way to contextualize Emily's words, to dilute their weight, to frame them as the fear of youth rather than the truth of observation. Yet every line he read carried the resonance of the pointing finger, the unflinching eyes, the 2 words that had punctured his carefully built arguments. Daniels, the prosecutor, did not gloat, but he allowed himself a moment to reflect on the force of truth as it had unfolded. Evidence, experts, and precedents were powerful tools, but the testimony of a child had done what strategy alone could not. 2 words, delivered with clarity and courage, had shifted the trial in ways that procedural law often failed to account for. They had reached the hearts, the minds, and the moral reasoning of everyone who witnessed them. As evening fell, the courthouse lights cast long shadows across the polished floors. Emily, back in the quiet of her home, clutched her rabbit and tried to unwind the tension that had held her tight all day. She did not understand the enormity of what she had done, the way her gesture and her words had rippled outward to affect the lives and reputations of grown men, seasoned attorneys, jurors, and reporters alike. She only remembered the fear she had felt on that street, the noise, the shouting, and the need to speak what she saw. Her parents, quietly proud but anxious, watched her in the soft lamplight. "You were very brave today," her mother said, smoothing her hair. Emily shrugged, hugging the rabbit close. "I just said what happened," she whispered. And in that moment, she understood. In her mind, she had only told the truth. She had not tried to sway anyone or be heroic. But her honesty had resonated far beyond her understanding, shaping the trial in a way adults could scarcely anticipate. Back in the courthouse, jurors retired to deliberate, each carrying Emily's words with them. Discussions were careful, deliberate, and yet permeated by the ghost of her testimony. They reviewed procedures, witness statements, and expert analysis, but beneath all the evidence lay a single undeniable fact. A child had seen something adults had either overlooked or rationalized. A child had pointed and spoken and reminded everyone that truth could be simple, yet devastatingly powerful. Officer Harlan sat alone in the now empty courtroom for a moment, stroking Rex's fur. The dog leaned into his hand, a solid, calming presence. Harlan reflected on the day, on the consequences of the incident, and on the extraordinary impact of Emily's 2 words. He realized that no matter the trial's outcome, the perception of that moment, the finger, the voice, the simplicity of judgment, would remain with everyone who had witnessed it. And that weight, he knew, was as potent as any ruling, any verdict, any official record. As night settled over the town, the courthouse emptied completely. Streetlights flickered on, casting pools of gold across the sidewalks, illuminating the departing townspeople deep in discussion, their voices carrying Emily's words into the streets, the cafes, the homes of those who would later tell the story to friends, neighbors, and family. Bad dog, 2 words that carried more power than any exhibit, more resonance than any argument. Even Rex, ever loyal, seemed to sense the shift in the human world around him. Though nothing had changed in his routine, in his training, in the trust he shared with Harlan, the human's perception had shifted irrevocably. He remained calm, obedient, and poised, yet the shadow of 2 words hung over him like a quiet echo, one that could not be ignored, corrected, or diminished. The town, too, felt the ripples. Conversations continued into the night. People debated, discussed, and even argued about the incident, the dog, and the child's testimony. The story would be retold for weeks, months, and possibly years, a reminder of how innocence, observation, and honesty could reshape the understanding of events far more than careful argumentation ever could. And in the quiet, after the reporters had gone, after the jurors had retired, after the townspeople had dispersed, the courthouse itself seemed to sigh. Within its walls, the echo of a child's words lingered, a lasting reminder that truth often arrives in the smallest packages, sometimes pointing with a trembling finger, sometimes spoken in 2 simple, unforgettable words. Bad dog. It was a moment that changed everything. The perception of Rex, the course of the trial, and the understanding of everyone who had witnessed it. And though life outside would continue, the impact of that day, the finger, the words, the courage of a small child, would linger, a quiet, indelible mark on the town, the courtroom, and the hearts of all who had watched.